On June 22nd of 2026, the President of the United States quietly signed a set of orders that started a countdown clock nobody can stop now. Not a countdown measured in weeks or months. A countdown measured in years, ending in 2030 and 2031, aimed directly at the most sensitive computer systems in the entire federal government, including the systems that control America's nuclear command structure. And here is the part almost nobody is talking about. If the Pentagon misses these deadlines, the exposure is not theoretical. It is data that adversaries may already be quietly collecting right now, waiting patiently for the day a quantum computer becomes powerful enough to crack it wide open. Stick around, because this story involves nuclear command systems, a hidden four-year acceleration, and a government-wide scramble that is already underway behind closed doors. Let's start with exactly what happened that day, because the White House did not sign one order. It signed two, and the pairing between them tells you everything about how seriously this administration is treating the quantum threat. The first order, formerly known as Executive Order 1229411, entitled Ushering in the Next Frontier of Quantum Innovation, directs the Department of Energy 14409, titled Securing the Nation Against Advanced Cryptographic Attacks, pushes the entire federal government to migrate toward cryptographic standards specifically designed to survive an attack from a quantum computer. Read those two titles again side by side, because together they form a complete strategic picture. One order accelerates the very technology capable of eventually breaking today's encryption. The other order races to defend against that exact same threat before it fully arrives. The White House was remarkably direct about this pairing in its own public fact sheet, framing the two orders as complements, one building quantum capability, the other defending against the cryptographic risks that capability will eventually create. Now let's talk about the deadlines themselves, because this is where the story gets genuinely urgent. Executive Order 14409 sets two specific dates. By December 31st, 2030, federal civilian agencies must transition their high-value assets for key establishment to post-quantum cryptography, specifically a NIST standardized algorithm known as ML-Chem. By December 31st, 2031, those same agencies must migrate their digital signature systems to a companion standard known as MLDSA. Contractors working with the federal government face a parallel deadline, required to comply with the relevant federal information processing standards by the end of 2030 as well. To understand why these specific dates matter so much, you need to understand what they replaced. Back in 2022, under the previous administration, National Security Memorandum 10 set a government-wide target for this exact same migration, but that target ran all the way out to 2035. Trump's new order pulls that timeline forward by 4 to 5 full years. In government cybersecurity terms, that is an enormous acceleration, essentially compressing what agencies expected to be a leisurely decade-long transition into a genuinely tight, high-pressure sprint. Why the sudden urgency? The order itself states the reasoning plainly, and it centers on a threat that does not require a working quantum computer to exist today. It is called Harvest Now, Decrypt Later, and it describes a chillingly simple strategy. Foreign adversaries do not need to break your encryption this year. They simply need to steal or intercept your encrypted data now, store it quietly, and wait. Once a sufficiently powerful quantum computer eventually comes online, years from now, all of that previously unreadable data becomes instantly readable. Unlocked all at once like a vault nobody thought could ever be opened. Executive Order 14409 does not dance around this risk. It states directly that adversaries may already be collecting encrypted federal data right now, in this exact moment, banking it away for a future decryption event. Security experts treat this as an ongoing operational reality for nation-state actors, not some distant hypothetical. And the categories of data most at risk are exactly the categories you would expect to matter for decades into the future. Diplomatic communications, defense archives, healthcare records, anything with what security professionals call a long confidentiality lifetime, meaning the information needs to stay secret for many years, not just for the next news cycle. Once that data gets harvested today, there is no way to undo it later. You cannot retroactively protect information that has already been copied and quietly stored somewhere overseas. This is precisely why the 2035 deadline suddenly felt unacceptably slow to national security planners. Every year of delay is another year of data sitting, exposed in some adversary's storage system, patiently waiting for quantum decryption to become possible. Before we go further, if this kind of deep dive into the policy decisions actually shaping national cybersecurity is valuable to you, go ahead and tap that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel keep making breakdowns like this one. Now here is where the story takes its most important turn, the part that connects directly back to this video's title. You might assume that when the president signs an order about securing government systems against quantum threats, the Pentagon automatically falls under that mandate along with everyone else. That assumption would be wrong, and understanding exactly why reveals one of the most fascinating structural details buried inside this entire policy rollout. Executive Order 14409 explicitly applies only to civilian federal agencies and their contractors. National security systems, the specific classification covering military command structures, weapon systems, intelligence operations, and cryptology are formally exempt from this particular civilian order. In other words, the Pentagon and the broader intelligence community are not directly bound by the same 2030 and 2031 deadlines Trump's order sets for the rest of the federal government. That might sound like the military is somehow getting a pass, but the reality turned out to be almost the exact opposite, just one day after. Trump signed his 2 executive orders. The Department of War, formerly known as the Department of Defense, released its own dedicated post-quantum cryptography strategy, a 25-page mandate covering every single military system, from battlefield communications networks all the way up to nuclear command and control infrastructure. And here is the striking part. Rather than setting a looser, more relaxed timeline for itself, the Pentagon voluntarily adopted the exact same aggressive deadline structure, setting a binding 2031 mandate for quantum-resistant encryption across every deployed military system. Think about what that means. The Pentagon was legally exempt from the civilian order's deadlines, and it chose to hold itself to essentially the same aggressive timeline anyway, through its own independent strategy document. That is not a bureaucracy dragging its feet on an unwanted mandate. That is a bureaucracy looking at the exact same threat data the White House was looking at, and concluding entirely on its own that waiting until 2035 was simply too dangerous to accept. The Pentagon strategy document did not hide the stakes either. It explicitly named nuclear command communications as facing existential risk from the quantum threat, language you do not see thrown around casually inside a formal government cybersecurity strategy. When military planners use the word existential in connection with nuclear command and control systems, they are telling you in the clearest possible terms exactly how seriously they view the consequences of failing to modernize these systems in time. The document also echoed the same harvest now, decrypt later warning found in the civilian order, specifically noting that adversaries may already hold harvested classified military traffic, quietly stored away and waiting for the day quantum decryption becomes operationally possible. If that warning is accurate, and there is little reason for military cybersecurity planners to overstate a threat this specific and this alarming without solid underlying intelligence, then the clock is not just ticking towards some future vulnerability. It may already be ticking on data that has already left the building. So now let's get to the actual question driving this entire video. What happens if the Pentagon misses its own 2031 deadline? This is where things get genuinely uncomfortable, because the honest answer involves layers of risk that stack directly on top of each other, rather than simply representing one clean, isolated failure. The most immediate consequence involves exactly the kind of data the strategy document already flagged as existential. Nuclear command and control communications represent, by definition, some of the most consequential secrets any government protects, systems designed to ensure that launch authority, targeting information, and strategic coordination remain absolutely secure under every possible circumstance, including outright warfare. If those systems are still running on cryptography, vulnerable to quantum decryption past the point where a functional quantum computer exists, the theoretical risk stops being theoretical. It becomes a live vulnerability sitting inside the single most sensitive category of government communication that exists. Beyond nuclear command specifically, missing the deadline creates cascading risk across every other category of military. Communication the strategy covers, from battlefield coordination between deployed units to the broader intelligence sharing infrastructure connecting the United States with its allies. A missed migration deadline does not necessarily mean every system becomes instantly compromised the moment the calendar flips into 2032. Quantum computers capable of actually breaking current encryption standards at meaningful scale still do not exist yet, based on everything we know publicly about the current state of quantum hardware. But the entire strategic logic behind these deadlines assumes that gap will not last much longer, and being caught unprepared when it finally closes creates a scramble scenario nobody wants to be managing during an actual moment of geopolitical tension. There is also a slower, more insidious version of failure worth considering, one that does not require missing the deadline outright, but simply falling behind schedule in ways that compound over time. Migrating cryptographic systems across an organization is massive, and technically fragmented, as the Department of War is an extraordinarily complex undertaking. It requires identifying every single place where vulnerable encryption is currently running, a task cybersecurity experts describe as building a complete cryptographic inventory, something many large organizations, government, and private sector alike genuinely struggle to compile accurately even under far less time pressure than this. Legacy systems present a particularly stubborn challenge here. Military infrastructure often includes hardware and software that has been in continuous operation for decades, systems built long before anyone seriously worried about quantum computing, sometimes running on architecture that makes modern cryptographic upgrades technically difficult or even physically impossible without significant hardware replacement. Swapping out cryptography inside a piece of software running on a modern cloud server is relatively straightforward. Swapping out cryptography embedded inside decades-old weapons, systems, satellite communication hardware, or classified command infrastructure is an entirely different order of engineering challenge, one that cannot simply be solved by pushing a software update. If you are new to this channel, now would be a great time to hit subscribe, because we break down exactly these kinds of overlooked national security stories that rarely get the mainstream attention they genuinely deserve. Let's talk about accountability, because this is where the story becomes genuinely interesting from a governance perspective rather than a purely technical one. Executive Order 14409 does not simply set deadlines and hope agencies comply out of good faith. It builds in specific structural mechanisms designed to create real pressure. Each agency is required to designate a dedicated post-quantum cryptography migration lead, an actual named individual reporting directly to that agency's chief information officer, creating a clear line of personal accountability, rather than leaving the responsibility diffused across some anonymous committee. The order also directs the Office of Management and Budget, working alongside the National Cyber Director, to coordinate strategy across the entire government, essentially creating a centralized oversight function, specifically watching whether agencies are actually hitting their interim milestones on the way toward the final 2030 and 2031 deadlines. The Department of Commerce, the National Security Agency, and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency are all tasked with delivering ongoing technical guidance, meaning agencies are not simply left to figure out this extraordinarily complex migration entirely on their own. There's also a real-world pilot program built into the timeline, specifically designed to catch problems early. The Department of Commerce is required to complete a pilot migration project on selected NIST computer systems by the end of 2027, years before the final government-wide deadlines actually arrive. This pilot exists precisely so that unexpected technical obstacles, the kind of problems that only reveal themselves once you actually attempt a real migration rather than just planning one on paper, get identified and addressed early, rather than discovered for the first time during a panicked rush in late 2030. For federal contractors, the accountability mechanism runs through procurement itself. The order directs the agencies responsible for writing federal contracting rules to issue a formal regulation requiring contractors to comply with the relevant federal information processing standards by the end of 2030, with an expectation that a corresponding clause will eventually appear inside the federal acquisition regulation itself. In plain language, this means companies that want to keep doing business with the federal government will eventually be contractually required to prove their own systems meet these same post-quantum cryptography standards, extending the deadline's real-world pressure well beyond government agencies alone and directly into the private sector companies that support them. That contractor requirement matters enormously for the Pentagon specifically, because the Department of War relies on an enormous ecosystem of private defense contractors, building everything from weapon systems to communications, infrastructure to logistics software. Even if the Pentagon's own internal systems migrate successfully and on schedule, the broader military supply chain remains only as secure as its weakest contractor link. A major defense contractor that fails to complete its own cryptographic migration on time could end up representing exactly the kind of vulnerability that undermines the entire military's carefully coordinated timeline, regardless of how well the Pentagon's own internal teams perform. This is precisely why one cybersecurity analysis of the order put it so bluntly. The standards already exist. The deadlines now exist. The real gating challenge for almost every organization involved, government and contractor alike, comes down to the more mundane but genuinely difficult task of simply knowing exactly what cryptography is currently running and precisely where, across an enormous, sprawling, decades-old technology footprint. You cannot upgrade what you have not properly inventoried. That inventory process alone represents months or years of painstaking technical work before the actual cryptographic swap even begins. There is a healthy amount of skepticism worth acknowledging here, too, because ambitious government deadlines have a long, well-documented history of slipping once the genuinely hard implementation work actually begins. One cybersecurity outlet covering this order noted precisely this concern, observing that the real teeth behind these deadlines are still being written through the Office of Management and Budget's 90-day guidance, and the eventual federal acquisition regulation rules still working their way through the bureaucratic process. Until those specific enforcement mechanisms fully materialize, there remains a genuine open question about whether 2030 and 2031 become real enforceable procurement pressure or simply another ambitious federal migration target that quietly slips once agencies encounter the inevitable technical and budgetary obstacles standing in their way. That skepticism is reinforced by another important detail buried inside the order's fine print. The quantum computing executive orders do not allocate any new dedicated funding. Agencies are instead directed to use existing resources to accomplish this entire massive migration effort. Anyone who has watched large government technology initiatives unfold over the years knows that unfunded mandates, no matter how urgent or well-intentioned, frequently struggle against the harsh reality of competing budget priorities, especially when the deadline sits years in the future and near-term budget pressures always feel more immediately pressing. The Pentagon's own separate strategy document offers a bit more reassurance on this specific front, since the Department of War has historically maintained substantially larger technology modernization budgets compared to many civilian agencies, and its own strategy was developed internally with presumably realistic awareness of what its existing resources can actually accomplish within the stated timeline. The Pentagon has also reportedly been migrating toward post-quantum cryptography for several years already, under an existing NSA framework known as the Commercial National Security Algorithm Suite 2.0, meaning the 2031 deadline represents an acceleration and formalization of work already underway, rather than an entirely new effort starting completely from zero. That existing head start matters enormously when assessing how realistic the Pentagon's self-imposed 2031 deadline genuinely is. Organizations that have already been quietly working toward a goal for several years generally have a much stronger chance of hitting an accelerated deadline compared to organizations starting completely from scratch under sudden new time pressure. Still, accelerating an already massive undertaking from a comfortable multi-year runway down to a genuinely tight deadline introduces real execution risk, particularly across an organization as vast, technically fragmented, and bureaucratically complex as the United States military. It is worth spending a little more time on exactly what these new cryptographic standards actually are, because the acronyms involved sound intimidating, but the underlying concept is not nearly as complicated as it first appears. The two algorithms specifically named inside Executive Order 1449 are ML-Chem, which handles key establishment, essentially the process of two systems securely agreeing on a shared secret before they start communicating, and MLDSA, which handles digital signatures, the mechanism that lets a system verify a piece of data genuinely came from where it claims to have come from and has not been tampered with along the way. These are not experimental, cutting-edge algorithms still being debated inside academic journals. They were formally finalized by the National Institute of Standards and Technology back in August of 2024, following years of open, rigorous public competition among cryptographers from around the world, specifically designed to identify mathematical approaches that remain secure even against a sufficiently powerful quantum computer. That distinction matters enormously for understanding why these deadlines feel achievable to policymakers, even though 4 to 5 years might sound tight for a government-wide technology migration. The hard scientific work of actually designing quantum-resistant cryptography is already finished. NIST spent the better part of a decade running an open adversarial evaluation process, inviting cryptographers worldwide to attempt to break candidate algorithms, gradually narrowing the field down to the strongest surviving approaches. What remains now is not a scientific research problem anymore. It is an enormous, but fundamentally more straightforward, engineering and logistics problem, actually implementing already proven algorithms across millions of individual systems, devices, and pieces of software currently running older, vulnerable encryption methods. This is precisely why cybersecurity experts reacted to these executive orders, with language describing them as an unambiguous signal, rather than expressing surprise or confusion about the underlying technical approach. Garfield Jones, an executive at the cybersecurity company QSecure, specifically framed the order this way, emphasizing that the message being sent to industry and government alike could not be clearer. The standards exist, the mathematics has been rigorously tested, and now the only remaining question is whether the sprawling federal government and its enormous contractor ecosystem can actually execute the implementation fast enough to meet these newly compressed deadlines. Let's also examine how the private sector has been reacting to this entire policy shift, because government mandates like this one rarely stay contained purely within government walls. Cloudflare, one of the largest infrastructure companies powering a significant portion of the modern internet, published its own public response, specifically welcoming the executive order, noting the federal government has a long, well-established track record of using its own massive purchasing power and regulatory leadership to drive broader technology adoption across the private sector as a whole. When the federal government mandates a specific technical standard for its own systems and contractors, That mandate frequently ends up shaping how much of the broader technology industry operates as well, simply because so many companies either sell directly to the government or build infrastructure that eventually interacts with government systems somewhere along the way. This ripple effect helps explain why cybersecurity companies, cloud infrastructure providers, and major technology vendors have been paying such close attention to this specific executive order, even though many of them are not federal agencies themselves and are not directly bound by its deadlines. Contractors serving the federal government represent an enormous slice of the broader technology economy, and the eventual Federal Acquisition Regulation Clause requiring cryptographic compliance will likely push many of these companies to complete their own post-quantum migrations well ahead of any formal legal requirement, simply to remain competitive for lucrative government contracts once the new compliance rules fully take effect. Industry trade groups have offered a mixed but generally supportive reaction to the aggressive new timeline as well. John Miller, an executive vice president at the Information Technology Industry Council, a major technology trade association, publicly described the order as setting appropriately aggressive timelines for federal agencies. That kind of endorsement from an industry group representing companies that will ultimately need to comply with these same standards carries real weight, suggesting the broader technology sector views this accelerated timeline as ambitious but fundamentally achievable, rather than reckless or unrealistic, given how mature the underlying cryptographic standards already are. Let's dig a bit deeper into exactly how large and complicated the actual implementation challenge really is, because understanding the sheer scale involved helps explain why even a seemingly generous 4-year runway might still prove genuinely difficult to meet. The individual agencies, thousands of individual systems, and untold millions of individual pieces of hardware and software, much of it, built at wildly different points in time using wildly different technical standards. Some systems were designed within the past few years using modern, flexible cryptographic libraries that can likely be updated through relatively straightforward software patches. Others were designed decades ago, embedded inside specialized hardware that was never intended to be easily modified once deployed. This fragmentation problem is compounded by a workforce challenge that rarely gets enough attention in casual conversation about these deadlines. Post-quantum cryptography migration requires specialized expertise that remains genuinely scarce across both government and industry. Simply finding enough qualified cryptography engineers to actually perform this enormous nationwide migration within the available time frame represents its own significant bottleneck, entirely separate from the purely technical challenges involved in the migration itself. Agencies competing against private sector companies, who can often offer significantly higher compensation for the same specialized cryptography expertise, may find themselves struggling to staff up the teams necessary to actually execute this migration on schedule, regardless of how clear and well-designed the underlying technical roadmap happens to be. There is also an important question worth considering about how this entire policy effort connects to the broader international picture, because the United States is far from the only government racing against this exact same quantum timeline. Other major world powers have been running their own parallel post-quantum cryptography migration efforts, driven by the exact same underlying harvest now, decrypt later concern. The specific pace and aggressiveness of America's newly compressed timeline inevitably gets compared, at least implicitly, against how quickly rival nations are moving towards similar cryptographic modernization within their own critical government and military infrastructure. That international competitive dynamic adds an additional layer of urgency beyond the purely defensive cybersecurity rationale driving these deadlines. If adversary nations are perceived to be moving faster toward both offensive quantum computing capability and their own defensive cryptographic modernization, falling behind on either front could represent a meaningful strategic disadvantage, not just a narrow cybersecurity vulnerability. This broader geopolitical framing likely played a meaningful role in convincing policymakers to accept the real execution risk involved in compressing what was originally envisioned as a comfortable decade-long transition down into a genuinely demanding 4 to 5 year sprint. It is also worth addressing directly why this particular policy area has managed to attract relatively broad bipartisan support, despite the deeply polarized nature of most other technology and national security debates happening across Washington right now. Post-quantum cryptography migration is fundamentally a defensive, infrastructure-focused initiative grounded in well-established mathematical science rather than contested political ideology. The underlying threat, foreign adversaries potentially gaining the ability to decrypt sensitive government communications, represents exactly the kind of clear, concrete national security concern that tends to generate consensus across party lines, even during periods of otherwise intense political disagreement over nearly everything else happening in government policy. That relatively broad consensus matters enormously for the practical question of whether these deadlines actually survive long enough to be met. Government technology initiatives frequently struggle not just against technical execution challenges, but against shifting political priorities whenever administrations change, with new leadership sometimes deprioritizing or even actively unwinding initiatives launched under a previous administration. The genuinely bipartisan nature of concern around quantum computing's cryptographic threat suggests this particular initiative carries a meaningfully lower risk of being abandoned or deprioritized due to shifting political winds, compared to more ideologically contested technology policy areas that frequently see dramatic reversals whenever political power changes hands in Washington. The same week these orders were signed, the administration's companion order directed the Department of Energy to lead a national push toward building a genuinely powerful quantum computer for scientific research, backed by a White House fact sheet noting the administration has already invested $625 million in national quantum research institutes through partnerships with industry and academia. That order set its own deadlines as well, including a target for the Pentagon to field at least 3 next-generation quantum sensor projects by September 30th of 2028, a full 2 years before the cryptographic migration deadline even arrives. That pairing reveals the underlying strategic logic driving this entire policy push. The same administration racing to accelerate America's own quantum computing capability is simultaneously racing to defend against the exact same technology falling into the hands of adversaries first. It is a genuinely difficult balancing act, essentially trying to win a technological race while also urgently hardening your own defenses against the possibility that a competitor might cross the finish line first, or that current encrypted secrets get exposed the moment anyone, friend or foe, actually gets there. So here is what to actually watch for as this story continues developing over the coming years. Pay close attention to whether the Office of Management and Budget's 90-day guidance and the eventual federal acquisition regulation rules materialize on schedule, since those specific enforcement mechanisms will ultimately determine how much real teeth these deadlines actually carry. Watch closely for the Department of Commerce's pilot migration project results by the end of 2027, since that early real-world test will likely reveal exactly what kinds of unexpected technical obstacles agencies across the government should brace for as the larger 2030 and 2031 deadlines approach. And pay particularly close attention to any public reporting on the Pentagon's specific progress toward its self-imposed 2031 mandate, since missing that particular deadline carries stakes extending well beyond typical government technology project delays, reaching directly into the security of the systems responsible for the nation's most consequential communications. Ultimately, this story represents something far more consequential than a routine cybersecurity policy update buried inside a White House press release. It represents a rare moment where the government openly acknowledged in formal legal language that a specific category of future technological capability poses risks serious enough to compress a planned decade-long security transition into less than half that time. Whether every agency and every contractor supporting them actually manages to hit 2026 is now running regardless, counting down toward 2030 and 2031, whether the systems responsible for protecting the nation's most sensitive secrets are actually ready or not. There's a certain irony worth sitting with as we close out this story, one that captures the strange, high-stakes nature of this entire moment in technological history. The same quantum computers that could eventually threaten decades of accumulated government secrets are simultaneously being funded, developed, and accelerated by that exact same government through the companion order directing the Department of Energy's own national quantum computing push. America is racing to build the very technology it is simultaneously racing to defend against, a strategic tightrope walk that only makes sense once you understand that the alternative, simply letting other nations develop this capability first, while doing nothing to prepare, represents a far more dangerous outcome than accepting the risk and complexity of pursuing both goals simultaneously. If this breakdown helped you understand exactly what is at stake behind these quantum executive orders, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe to this channel, because these are exactly the kinds of quietly massive policy decisions that will shape national security for decades, long before most mainstream coverage ever catches up to what they actually mean. This is a story that will keep evolving fast over the coming years, as agencies report progress, as pilot programs reveal unexpected obstacles, and as the 2030 deadline draws closer, and staying ahead of it means staying subscribed right here. Drop a comment letting me know whether you think the Pentagon actually hits its 2031 deadline, and I will see you in the next video.